Welcome to this very interesting webinar which ORF is organizing to bring you the latest thought in the scientific community on the vaccine for COVID-19 and where India stands vis-a-vis the rest of the world in preparing to deal with the post-pandemic situation in terms of vaccinating the masses. We have with us Professor Gagandeep Kang. She's a vaccine specialist who works at CMC Vellore. And we were supposed to also have the principal scientific advisor to the Government of India, Professor K Vijay Raghavan. Unfortunately, he is held up in a meeting, but we believe he will be able to join us during the conversation, and we'll soon have him with us. Let me just begin with some broad points on where do we stand today regarding the vaccine. And not only we as in India, but the whole world. The international vaccine trackers who are tracking the development, production, trial of the various vaccines that are being worked on to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, they indicate that there are currently 40 vaccines in clinical trials on humans, and at least 92 preclinical vaccines are under active investigation in animals across the world. Some 5 vaccines, 4 in China and 1 in Russia, are already approved for early or limited use in countries, but experts are wary that a fast-tracked process has its own risks. It is expected that a safe and effective coronavirus vaccine could be available by next year. When exactly next year, we'll get Dr. Kang to talk about it. Globally, there are 9 vaccines in phase 3 large-scale efficacy trials. The British-Swedish company AstraZeneca and the University of Oxford have a vaccine which is currently under clinical trial in India. And under a partnership, India's Serum Institute has already produced millions of doses to be used in global trials. Of the 15 vaccines in phase 2 expanded safety trials across the globe, 2 are from Indian companies, Zydus Cadila and the Bharat Biotech ICMR partnership. In addition, Novavax, another manufacturer in the phase 2 trial, has reached an agreement with the Serum Institute of India to produce as many as 2 billion units of the vaccine a year. Russia's Sputnik vaccine, which was approved without a phase 3 trial in the country, has negotiated agreements to supply the vaccine to countries including Brazil, Mexico, and India. This seems to be India's backup option as of now. Our Health Minister, Dr. Harshvardhan, has informed Parliament that a COVID-19 vaccine might be developed by early 2021. Once we have a vaccine, it will be unprecedented challenge. It will be an unprecedented challenge to take the vaccine to the masses in the country in terms of healthcare personnel, distribution efforts, and logistics. Although India has a relatively low proportion of elderly population, the absolute numbers are large. In addition, India has a huge non-communicable disease burden across age categories. This makes the vulnerable population a considerable demographic. India depends on its weak and underfunded healthcare system for vaccine delivery. To reach all Indians, the system capacity will have to be expanded considerably. Adhaar Model of the Serum Institute of India, the world's largest vaccine manufacturer, has said that not enough COVID-19 vaccines will be available for everyone in India until the end of 2024. So how is India going to deal with it? Professor Kang, what would be a reasonable estimate for the COVID-19 vaccine's arrival in the Indian market? A best case and a worst case scenario.
So a lot depends on the clinical efficacy results that we get. If we look at the vaccines that are in phase 3 trials now, the front runner among all of them that is likely to come into India is the AstraZeneca University of Oxford vaccine. They do have an interim analysis planned for the phase 3 studies that are being done outside of the country. The studies that they are doing in India are a much smaller size with 1,600 participants as opposed to the tens of thousands being tested in other parts of the world. If we get encouraging results from the AstraZeneca vaccine, I can see that efforts here would be ramped up, because here what we are looking for is largely a safety and an immunogenicity study. So we could be thinking, if there are positive results from the phase 3 outside, of earlier licensure in India. Where the other vaccines are concerned that are in phase 3 trials, we don't really have any at the moment. Covaxin and ZyCoV-D, depending on how their phase 2s go, can go into phase 3 trials, and both companies have planned their protocols for those. And with Novavax, we've heard that Novavax is coming into India with serum, and the health minister announced that trials will start in October. Novavax has done its phase 1 trials in Australia and is doing phase 2 trials in South Africa, and we should have results from those shortly. So best case, early next year. Worst case, maybe towards the end of next year or late or even beginning of 2022.
Thank you. We have with us Dr. K Vijay Raghavan. He is the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, and he is also Chairperson of the Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council. Dr. Raghavan, before you joined in, I had quoted Adhaar Poonawalla of the Serum Institute of India as saying that there's no way India can even think of having sufficient vaccine units or doses for the entire population before 2024. That sounds pretty depressing. And on top of it, what people are also wondering is that when the pandemic happened, the whole world was taken by surprise. But today we have had sufficient time. And is the government in the process of mapping the vaccination process in terms of creating or putting in place the required human infrastructure? After all, it has to be done through the state governments, and the state governments will be depending on their municipalities, on their panchayats, the primary care, healthcare centers. There will be cold chains required for it. So, is the government working towards that direction?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me just address a point you made about the world being taken by surprise at this pandemic. The world should not be taken by surprise, because over many, many years, many organizations and individuals have been pointing out the danger of exactly such pandemics. One example is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, in whose founding India took a very active role. And this was set up a few years ago precisely for these kinds of contexts. Of course, one cannot imagine specifically which kind of pandemic will occur when, but a preparedness for pandemics in general, or epidemics in general, was anticipated. The Global Preparedness Advisory Board, Management Board, as late as late November, I think, 2019, also cautioned against the danger of a respiratory pandemic. The fact of the matter is that the increasing and widely prevalent close proximity of humans in multiple contexts with other animals increases the likelihood of low probability events happening at a higher frequency. So this is expected. Now, in that situation, you've asked a question about what are the timelines of making vaccines and rolling them out. Typically, vaccine development takes decades, and typically they are rolled out to sections of the population who are most likely to be vulnerable and not to entire populations. Yellow fever vaccination for those who travel to yellow fever zones are an example. So this, therefore, requires an enormous logistical reconfiguration in a manner which doesn't affect our regular immunization program, yet rolls out vaccines as they get available to large parts of a population. Other Poonawala's point, if you look at it from a point of view of linear extrapolation of current methodology, it's a reasonable conclusion that it will take a long time to vaccinate the entire country, and we don't know how many times a vaccine will need to be used and how often vaccination needs to be done. But if one takes a parallel processing approach and scales up in multiple ways involving state governments, public sector, private sector on scale, in a partnership of the health ministry, led by the health ministry, but in partnership with other agencies, then it's feasible to think of doing something on scale through parallel processing. Examples of such parallel processing are the way, for example, very recently, the Adhaar registration was rolled out. One looked at it as a task to be taken upon by a linear execution of a process by a ministry. It would have taken a long time. But a parallel processing of that resulted in registration being done very rapidly. Our elections are another example of how a combination of collaborations can result in effective election functioning and deployment. So the government, to summarize, is looking at exactly these kinds of processes. The health ministry has met with the Ministry of IT, with those in the private sector who are good at deploying IT tools and enhancing the current vaccine intelligence network setup which is there, the cold chain and the delivery systems. So all those rehearsals, as it were, are in progress, just as other tools for getting the procurement into place on scale are going on. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Kang, once the vaccine arrives, people are very curious, and naturally so. What next? What are the requirements in terms of procurement, in terms of distribution and final administration? According to you, I mean, we just heard Dr. Raghavan explain that the government has already initiated the process of how best to scale up the distribution, vaccination. But as somebody who's involved with the science of vaccines, are you convinced that we are ready, we are prepared, or that we are on the way of getting ready and being prepared?
Well, the first caveat with all of this is that we hope we will have a vaccine. We don't know for sure that we will have a vaccine. We don't know when we will have the vaccine, and we certainly don't know how much of the vaccine we will have. So if we look at it, the one thing that is certain is that if there is a successful vaccine, there isn't going to be enough to give everybody on day one. And that's impossible. As Dr. Vijay Raghavan pointed out, the government understands that it's not going to be possible to deliver vaccine instantaneously to the entire country. So one of the efforts that CEPI and the WHO and the government have been thinking about is who gets the vaccine first when there are limited doses of vaccine available. The WHO has come out with its allocation principles, the principles based on which decisions should be made about the groups that should get vaccination. And one of the very important things that they have considered is the idea of thinking about who has responsibility for looking after sick people and therefore should be protected. There's also people with risk that is of different kinds that need to be looked at as priority groups to get vaccines. So once you have an allocation framework, a decision made on the principles by which you will give vaccine out, you need to know the numbers. Only then will you begin to think about how you will scale procurement, how you will scale delivery of the vaccine, both landing the vaccine in the country if it's coming from outside, or logistics for transport of the vaccine through the cold chain if it's manufactured within the country. The COVAX facility, which has been established by CEPI and by Gavi, to which India is a participant along with 155 other countries at the moment, is one mechanism by which we can get vaccine from global supply, and then we will have, hopefully, our own manufacturers making the vaccine. Again, as Dr. Vijay Raghavan pointed out, the logistics of delivering this vaccine are going to be extremely challenging. In India, our vaccination program is familiar with delivering vaccines to children and to pregnant women. We do not deliver vaccine to any other kind of adult, and even though other parts of the world do have immunization programs for the elderly, we don't have any such programs. So in terms of the planning exercise for delivering the vaccines, there really is a lot of preparation that needs to be done. And I'm really glad that the government is working with partners to do that. Over.
Dr. Vijay Raghavan, another aspect of this entire process is the fact that in our system, in our polity, health is a state subject. And as I said earlier too, that ultimately it will be the state governments who will have to ensure delivery, who will have to ensure that the vaccination process happens and it complies with the scheme that the central government figures out as to who gets it first and who gets it next. Along with that, there is also going to be a huge expectation management that will be expected of the central government. Because everybody, although it's not possible, as both of you have explained, that it's not possible to vaccinate everybody in the country, but yet everybody will expect that the government will ensure full and total vaccination. So, looking at the challenges and looking at the huge expectations, what would be your advice to the government?
Well, my advice to all of us would be, number one, stay calm and analyze the complexity and see what needs to be done. The challenge is the following. Oftentimes when we talk in public, we are assuming that there will be the vaccine coming out. It will be available at a certain time, and then we have to distribute it. We should remember, importantly, that we will have many vaccines coming, each one certainly different from the other, some more effective in some contexts than the others. And therefore, while early stages will be very complicated in deciding what vaccine to administer, depending on availability and efficacy and so on, over time, very soon in few months, more and more options will become available, more and more bulk will become available. So therefore, in terms of the supply side, the early stages will be tough, but soon we will have supplies at hand for immunization as multiple manufacturers come in with whichever vaccines are successful, and storage and fill and finish becomes more efficient, more available, both of which India is very good at. Then it breaks down to a distribution issue in a manner where it has to be done very calmly and in all the contexts you talked about. It is true that health is principally a state subject, but our immunization programs have always been done in close partnership with the health ministry at the center and in the state government. And that too has got a very good backbone on which other elements can now be added and amplified so that the supply chain logistics are well monitored and delivered. It is a large problem. It is not an impossible problem to tackle if the complexities are broken down to its components and administration done, and with good logging mechanisms of making sure what is being delivered where. I think we can also make sure that delivery is correct and not repetitive and reaches every place where it is necessary. Thank you.
Dr. Kang, it is now evident and also it's a given that India is going to be a major manufacturing hub for the COVID-19 vaccine, as and when the vaccines start hitting the market. Novavax alone is reportedly seeking 2 billion units of the vaccine to be manufactured in India. A related question to this is that if India is going to be such a major platform for the manufacture of this vaccine, are we assured that a certain amount of the vaccine that is produced in India will be used for vaccinating Indians, or will we wait while the rest of the world gets vaccinated? And linked to that is that what should be India's position regarding whose COVID-19 allocation plan, or what you referred to as the COVAX plan?
So I think when we look at Novavax, it's very important to remember that every vaccine is different. The Novavax vaccine is a vaccine that consists of a protein subunit, and this vaccine requires an adjuvant. The limiting feature in the manufacture of this vaccine is going to be the availability of the adjuvant. This is usually something that is not regarded when people think about manufacturing capacity, but for protein vaccines, this really, really matters. So I would really like to know which adjuvant Novavax is going to go with for this particular product and how they're going to be sourcing that adjuvant, because there is a limited supply of adjuvants in the world and very few manufacturers actually make them. Now, if the other thing that's important to remember is that we are not the only country that Novavax has come to. Novavax is in partnership with manufacturers in other parts of the world for making hundreds of millions of doses. So we will be major manufacturers, we will be major providers, but we will not be the only ones. Another thing to consider is that the Chinese manufacturing capacity has increased hugely, and the Chinese are further along in phase 3 trials than almost any country in the world. The US and China are currently leading where phase 3 trials are concerned. So for India, we have the advantages that we have been global suppliers for childhood immunization for a very long time. We are responsible for the bulk of pediatric immunizations around the world, and I hope that we will continue to contribute globally. Now the question is, does a global contribution mean that India loses out on its supply? from all that has been said and published, it appears that at least 50% of whatever is going to be made by Serum Institute will be available for Indian supply. Now, the questions will come up about how this will be procured, at what price, and that is something really for the government to deal with. But it's extremely unlikely that the bulk of the supply will go outside the country and leave us with the dregs of production. So while we will be good global citizens, I'm sure the government will make sure that our population is protected as well.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Vijay Raghavan, so who pays for it? Who funds the vaccine in terms of distribution, in terms of vaccination, in terms of basically funding the vaccination program? Do people pay for it? Is it a subsidized amount that people pay, or will there be categories that some people will have to pay the full amount, others will get it free? Has there been some thinking about it? Because again, I come back to the previous point that because health, as we all know, is primarily a state subject, the state governments are going to ask for money. That look, I mean, we need some amount of funding, if not entire funding. So, is there some thinking happening on these lines as to who pays for the vaccine?
Thank you very much. There are many components to this who pays. Procuring the vaccine and fill and finish and distribution and the costs of immunization and so on and so forth. Now, India, well, before I get to what India normally does and what we're doing here, it's important to keep in mind that this is a very unusual situation. The costs of vaccine, of immunization of our population will be large, but those costs are worth it because they save a huge, huge amount economically. This the government completely recognizes. There is no question about it. So we will not skimp on resources to ensure immunization of available vaccines fully. So that's the high-level picture which I think we need to see, which the government has very clearly said. Now, there are multiple mechanisms of doing this. India is what is called a Gavi donor country. It gives to Gavi, but it's also a Gavi recipient country. The result of this arrangement is India will get Gavi vaccines through a Gavi process at costs which are substantially lower than what non-Gavi countries get. So, for example, if vaccines cost $30 a dose in America, they could well cost about $3 a dose over here. So the checks which the government needs to sign would be much lower. Despite that, there would still be other requirements for the scale for vaccines to be procured. There too, the government will work with individual companies so that resources can be raised, so that the effective costs of the vaccination program are in the range I spoke about, with other sources coming into companies so that their investment, their interest, their manufacturing capacity and so on are subvented by multiple mechanisms. So while the short answer I gave was that vaccines will be available to our people at large, because the gains in funding that and ensuring that that happens are enormous. They are both from the health perspective necessary and also from the economic perspective very beneficial. But there are multiple mechanisms whereby this can be done in a large country such as ours.
But are we working on some sort of a scheme? Because we now have the pleasure of time. So are we thinking?
There is a high-level group chaired by Dr. Vinod Paul and co-chaired by the Health Secretary, which has members from the Finance Ministry, from the External Affairs Ministry, and other science agencies who are doing just this.
Thank you, sir. before we start wrapping up the conversation, Professor Kang, would you like to share some thoughts on this entire issue of vaccine, and what the people should know? One or two or three things that the people should know.
So I think the first thing that people should know is that I'm confident that regulators in India and elsewhere are not going to allow, say, products that are not safe and effective into the market. And particularly where WHO pre-qualification and global supply is concerned, the products that we get will be ones that have been rigorously tested. And when we use them, it's very important to understand that no vaccine is perfect. So protection from infection by a vaccine is different from protection from disease. We should not expect protection from infection, and we should expect reasonable protection from disease. That protection is not going to be perfect, so we are going to need to continue to take precautions and for a fairly long time. There is a lot about this disease that we don't understand. The duration for which people will be protected, how protection will work in different age groups. But as vaccines are developed and then are used, we will continue to learn and make sure that we refine the programs for vaccination with first generation vaccines while we work in parallel on the development of better second generation vaccines.
Professor Vijay Raghavan, there is a question for you from the audience. This person wants to know that how will the government ensure some sort of an equitable access to the vaccine? I mean, for people across the country. So if somebody maybe, say somebody is in a place which is distant and which does not have easy access, but would the people over there have easy access or equitable access to the vaccine?
Short answer is that is indeed the goal, and equity of access is the key point of a large immunization program such as this requires. There are many complexities in delivering, as we have discussed a little before. Let us say that you want to start with one category of people as the first recipients of a vaccine. Now that category is not going to be geographically located in one place. They're going to be distributed. And then the second category also similarly this will happen. And then the third. And then there will be requirements for re-immunization. So therefore, this is a very difficult and different challenge from routine immunization programs where you can sweep across the country starting from multiple places and completing your immunization. This needs to be done in a manner where dynamic requirements are met. So this is as much a logistical challenge in terms of the delivery pipeline, as well as a challenge in terms of making sure that that pipeline is functional through an IT end. So essentially an equivalent of bar tagging every component of the delivery pipeline to make sure that the cold chain and the distribution and the delivery are all taken into account. People are not vaccinated twice. People, when they don't need to be, people who need to get vaccinated are vaccinated. Identification, all that needs to be done. It seems an enormous challenge, and indeed it is. But it's exactly this kind of a challenge on this scale which India has grappled with and dealt with reasonably well in multiple other situations. So, and there is a momentum picking up on preparedness for this kind of a scale. So, it is complex, but I think it is doable if you grapple with the problem.
There is a linked question for you, sir, from the audience that, it's going to be a very complex process because, for instance, if it's a family, everybody in the family may not be getting vaccinated together. So then how do you deal with a community, with the locality, with the community, with the demography? So, it's mind-boggling if you really look at it with, for a country with India's population base.
It is mind-boggling, and the conceptual, problem scales up enormously if you look at the unit as the country. But if you break up this unit into small components of what you need to do at different times and different space, then this becomes handleable. Such complexity is not unusual in many of the other things we do. We have taken up many, many other kinds of challenges which require exactly this kind of a complexity, some of which we have done better and some of which we could do much better. So many of the components of experience which comes in dealing on this scale are there within our system. The challenge now is whether these different components can work together in this shared common purpose, but also without interfering in multiple ongoing programs which must carry on. Our nutrition programs must carry on. Our child immunization programs must carry on. Our maternal immunization programs must carry on. And indeed, the effort is to do exactly that. So I think these challenges can be met, and all the feedback which we can get from our listeners here today, from our community, from our citizens, will be assimilated, and this team I referred to you will push exactly dealing with exactly these kinds of complexities.
Professor Kang, there's a question for you from the audience, and I'll just read it out for you. Recently, there was a statement by the head of CDC USA that the COVID-19 vaccine or vaccines are going to offer only partial immunity, and wearing a mask and maintaining social distancing, following the normal protocol, is going to be more effective and hence necessary for comparatively better protection. So the vaccine may not be the magic cure or magic shield that people expect it to be.
The moment you said you have a question for Dr. Kang, I didn't pay attention to the question. So what is the question?
I'll just again read it out for you, sir. Recently, there was a statement by the head of CDC USA.
Right. I remember the question. Sorry. The important point is that we tend, and this is human nature, to look for something which will, you take one pill and all your problems are solved. You take one vaccine and everything is solved. This is a new disease. This is a complex disease. This is a pandemic. And every little bit of thing you can do to weaken its spread is valuable. So it will be very naive to say, well, 6 months down from now or 3 months down, they're going to have a vaccine. And so what's the big deal? I won't worry now. Or when I get a vaccine, or if I've been vaccinated, I'm not going to protect myself anymore. That would also be unwise. So it's very clear that for diseases like this, respiratory pathogens, it would be wise always to keep sufficient physical distance, be in the open or in ventilated spaces as much as feasible, and protect your nose and mouth, both as protection for others and for yourself. And this behavior will not go down for a while. We tend to think of vaccination and vaccines as the end game. In this pandemic, we must keep in mind that while things will get better, while our ability to deal with our lives and livelihood will get better, this is the early game. This is not even the mid game. That shouldn't depress us. That shouldn't prevent us from being innovative and doing wonderful things. That shouldn't prevent us from getting on with our social life and our economic life. But that requires us to take precautions in a manner so that, the progress of the disease is minimized in every way and not just wait for one way to solve it all.
If we were to compare it with a football game, we are nowhere near halftime as yet. This question actually came up for you, sir. In terms of deployment of vaccines, what role can technology play in ensuring efficient deployment? For example, in a recent interview, Nandan Nilekani said that India could use the Adhaar model to create a vaccination program to deal with COVID-19.
Well, those two op-eds from Nandan were very important, and they articulate very well, very intelligently and very coherently the role for IT in vaccine deployment. That's exactly what the committee I told you about had been working on for about a month or so, looking at ways by which multiple technologies which are currently being deployed, the Aadhaar, the Arogya Setu, the national telemedicine effort, the digital health mission, all of this plan to do that. We must remember when we use technology that there will always be debates of a kind which are not really, I should say, correctly posed. They will be posed usually about, is the technology got its limitations or is it perfect? Now that's a wrong kind of posing of questions. We must look at technology as enabling in our context and compare its use to what would happen if we didn't have it at all. Is it beneficial? Is its presence valuable? And is its absence going to be felt? And it is not a substitute for a critical human interface in health, which needs to be scaled and also simultaneously dealt with. So yes, short answer, technology would be very, very valuable. It is essential. But in addition to that, we need a scaling up of the delivery human resources, and that is something which is also being looked at. The National Health Authority, the Health Ministry, and others are scaling up for other reasons, and they will also, I'm sure, integrate this aspect into it.
Thank you, sir. There is also the cynical view. For instance, somebody in the audience wants to know that after all the promises that were made for a vaccine to deal with HIV, no vaccine actually came up. So what makes us so confident that we will have a vaccine to deal with COVID-19? And I'm quoting the questioner, the person who has put up this question, that after all, we are dealing with viruses, whether it is HIV or COVID-19.
It's not that there is a disease and a vaccine is a generic standard solution. The process of developing a vaccine is something very complex and mimics the ways by which the immune system potentially can behave against the disease. So these are two independent components. With diseases such as HIV, malaria, and TB, each for very different reasons, and each for reasons which you've understood in great depth biologically, vaccines have proven to be difficult. So these are all par for the course in evolution, where just as we trick evolution by making a vaccine against a disease, evolution has had hundreds of millions of years to work in nefarious ways to play tricks in specific other cases also. So it is a lottery. Sometimes you win and you have an easy vaccine, and sometimes you don't. I think the world has been spoilt in some way, and I'm using spoilt in quotes in a sort of positive sense, by having some of the early successes being so extraordinary. Smallpox is one, polio is another. And the assumption, therefore, that here is a disease that I'll get you a vaccine is a high expectation. But that will not be the case. Some vaccines will be very difficult. That said, a vaccine against a coronavirus seems increasingly feasible. There are many potential problems even here, which we will only have to experience to say whether they will come about or not. Time will tell. And that is whether there will be such dramatic change in the virus that every year, so that we will need a new vaccine every year. We don't know whether that's the case or not. It seems not very likely, but we don't know. And there could be similarly other responses, changes in the virus which prevent vaccines from being functional, or so on and so on. So these are, as far as we can tell with SARS coronavirus 2, that does not yet seem to be a problem. One could have speculated that there would be a problem some months ago, but increasingly it looks that a vaccine would indeed be feasible, but until it happens, it hasn't happened.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Kang. Thank you, Dr. Vijay Raghavan, for joining us for this excellent and very insightful conversation. Both of you have provided answers that everybody is seeking. I mean, this is one thing which I think agitates every mind in the country today. When is the vaccine coming? When it comes, will I get it, or will I have to stand in a queue? Who will pay for it, etc., etc. And these answers were necessary, I think, also to sort of address public and popular concerns. So thank you, both of you. And on behalf of ORF, I would like to thank you for joining us. And I would like to thank the audience for joining us for this webinar. And let's hope for the best. Let's hope that a vaccine comes in soon and the government will be able to deal with the complex problem of distributing the vaccine, ensuring that it reaches the last person in the most effective manner. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.